Sometimes the things people throw away are exactly what you need most. Sometimes what looks like a burden becomes your greatest blessing. When Maggie inherited her grandfather's old house, her family mocked her for taking on what they saw as a worthless pile of rotting wood. The Victorian on Maple Street was falling apart, covered in vines, with broken windows and a roof that leaked every time it rained. Her siblings, Anton, Bree, and Jed, had gotten the real inheritance. The money, the jewelry, the valuable things. All Maggie got was a house nobody wanted, but 52 years of life had taught her something her family never learned. Home isn't about perfection, it's about possibility. Standing on that sagging porch with her 10-year-old son Tucker, she saw what they couldn't see. This wasn't just a broken-down house. This was their chance to finally belong somewhere. What they would discover inside those walls would change everything they thought they knew about their family. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the overgrown front yard as Maggie turned off the engine of her 15-year-old Honda Civic. The silence that followed felt heavy with possibility and doubt in equal measure. Tucker unbuckled his seatbelt and pressed his face against the passenger window, his breath fogging the glass as he studied the house that would become their new home. "It's bigger than I thought it would be," he said quietly, his voice carrying that careful tone children use when they're not sure if something is good or bad. Maggie followed his gaze to the 3-story Victorian that dominated the corner lot. The house had good bones, she could see that much through the neglect. The wraparound porch still held traces of its former grandeur, though the white paint had peeled away in long strips, revealing weathered grey wood beneath. Ivy had claimed the entire east wall, creeping up past the 2nd-story windows and reaching toward the peaked roof where several shingles had gone missing. "Grandpa Samuel lived here all by himself?" Tucker asked, climbing out of the car and shouldering his backpack. "For the last 30 years, yes." Maggie retrieved their suitcases from the trunk, grateful she'd packed light. Everything else they owned was either in storage back in Detroit or crammed into the small U-Haul trailer they'd pick up tomorrow. Before that, it was his parents' house. "Your great-great-grandparents built it in 1892. Tucker's eyes widened. "That's really old." "Old houses have stories," Maggie said, fishing the keys from her purse. The brass key ring felt substantial in her palm, worn smooth by decades of Samuel's fingers. "We just have to listen for them." The front steps groaned under their weight, but they held firm. Maggie noticed someone had recently swept the porch. Probably Mrs. Henderson, the neighbor who'd been looking after the place since Samuel's funeral 6 weeks ago. A small kindness that made Maggie's throat tighten with unexpected emotion. The front door stuck, warped by years of humidity and neglect, before giving way with a reluctant scrape against the threshold. The smell hit them first. Mustiness and old wood. The faint sweetness of decay mixed with something else. Lemon oil, maybe, and the lingering ghost of pipe tobacco. "Whoa," Tucker whispered, stepping into the front hall. Even in the dim light filtering through dirty windows, the house's former elegance was unmistakable. A carved wooden staircase curved gracefully to the 2nd floor, its mahogany banister dulled but unbroken. Crown molding traced the edges where walls met ceiling, and the original hardwood floors stretched in every direction, scuffed and worn but solid beneath their feet. Maggie found the light switch and flicked it, surprised when the overhead fixture responded with warm yellow light. Mrs. Henderson had mentioned keeping the utilities on, bless her heart. "The wallpaper's peeling," Tucker observed, running his finger along a loose edge near the doorway. "We can fix that," Maggie said, though privately she wondered how much fixing they could afford. Her savings account had exactly $3,247 in it, and her new job at the county clerk's office wouldn't start until Monday. But Tucker was watching her face, reading her expressions the way only children can, so she smiled and set down their suitcases with authority. "Come on, Let's explore. The front parlor still held Samuel's furniture, a burgundy velvet sofa that had seen better decades, a coffee table stacked with old newspapers, and in the corner, a recliner positioned to face the street. On the windowsill sat a pair of wire-rimmed reading glasses, folded as if Samuel had just set them down after finishing the morning paper. Tucker picked up the glasses carefully, holding them up to the light. These were his, must have been. Maggie took them gently from his hands, studying the bifocal lenses that still held smudges and fingerprints. Through the glasses she could see the impression left by folded newspaper, the crossword puzzle, partially completed in Samuel's careful handwriting. The date showed 2 days before he died. "What was he like?" Tucker asked. "I mean, I know he was your grandpa, but what was he really like?" It was a fair question, and one Maggie struggled to answer honestly. She'd only met Samuel a handful of times during her childhood, brief visits when her mother brought the family down from Chicago for Christmas or summer vacations. Her memories were fragments, his quiet voice, the way he always seemed to be watching from the edges of family gatherings, the pipe he smoked on the back porch while the adults talked inside. "He was gentle," she said finally. "Quiet, your great-grandmother. Always said he kept to himself too much after your great-grandmother died. Never remarried, never seemed to have close friends, just lived here alone, tending his garden and reading his books." That sounds lonely. Maybe, or maybe he liked the peace. Maggie set the glasses back on the windowsill, exactly where they'd been. Some instinct told her not to disturb things too quickly. People grieve differently, Tucker. Some need crowds and noise. Others need quiet and space to remember. They moved through the house room by room, cataloguing what needed immediate attention. The kitchen was surprisingly functional, though the appliances belonged to another era. Avocado green refrigerator, harvest gold stove, and a dishwasher that looked like it had never been used. But the plumbing worked, and the gas burners lit with a satisfying whoosh. "No microwave," Tucker noted. "We'll get one." Maggie opened the refrigerator, relieved to find it empty and clean. Mrs. Henderson's work again, no doubt. "For now, we cook like people used to cook." Upstairs, they found 3 bedrooms and a bathroom with a clawfoot tub that made Tucker grin with delight. Samuel's room was at the front of the house, overlooking Maple Street. His bed was made with military precision, the quilt pulled tight and tucked under the mattress without a wrinkle. The dresser top held only the essentials, a wooden hairbrush, a small dish for pocket change, and a framed photograph of a woman Maggie didn't recognize. "Who's that?" Tucker asked, pointing to the photograph. Maggie picked it up, studying the sepia-toned portrait of a young woman with kind eyes and an elegant bearing. She wore a hat with a small feather, and her dress suggested the photograph was taken decades ago. There was something familiar about her face, but Maggie couldn't place it. "I don't know," she admitted. "Maybe a friend of his grandmother's or a cousin. Old houses are full of photographs of people nobody remembers anymore." Tucker's room would be at the back of the house, with windows facing the large backyard. It was smaller than his room in Detroit, but the slanted ceiling under the eaves gave it character. Someone had painted it yellow years ago, and while the color had faded, it still felt cheerful. "I like it," Tucker said, testing the window sash. It opened with effort, letting in the evening air and the sound of crickets beginning their nightly chorus. "Can I see the backyard?" They went downstairs and out through the kitchen door. The yard was larger than it had appeared from the street, running back a full quarter-acre before ending at a line of oak trees. A vegetable garden had gone wild along the south fence, tomato vines sprawling unchecked, and herbs growing with abandoned enthusiasm. "Look," Tucker said, pointing to a small wooden structure near the back corner, a workshop. The shed was well built, with a proper foundation and windows that had been recently cleaned. Inside, they found Samuel's tools arranged with the same precision as his bedroom, hammers hung by size, screwdrivers sorted by type, and a workbench clear except for a half-finished birdhouse and a coffee can full of wood screws. "He made things," Tucker said, running his hand over the smooth workbench. Surface. His father was a carpenter, Maggie remembered. I guess it ran in the family. They ate dinner, sitting on the front porch steps, sharing a pizza Tucker had talked her into ordering from town. The delivery driver had looked skeptical about the address, as if he couldn't believe anyone actually lived in the old Whitfield place. Word would be getting around by tomorrow that Samuel's granddaughter had moved in. In a town like Millbrook, news traveled faster than gossip, and gossip traveled at the speed of light. "Are you scared?" Tucker asked as they watched the sun set behind the trees. "Of what? Living here, being the only ones, starting over again?" Maggie considered lying, giving him the reassuring answer a mother was supposed to give. But Tucker had been through 3 moves in his 10 years, watched her work 2 jobs to keep them afloat, and never once complained about things other kids took for granted. He deserved honesty. "A little," she said. "But I'm excited too. This is the first time we've had a chance to really stay somewhere, to put down roots, and it's ours. Tucker, no landlord, no lease, no wondering if we'll have to move again next year. The kids at school will be different here. Probably. Southern kids, small town kids, but kids are kids everywhere. You'll make friends." Tucker nodded, but she could see him working through the math of being new, of being different, of being one of only a handful of black families in a town where everyone else had known each other since birth. They'd had this conversation before, in Detroit and in Cleveland before that. Being strong got easier with practice, but it never got easy. That night, they slept on air mattresses in the front parlor, too tired to haul anything upstairs. Maggie lay awake, listening to the house settle around them, the tick of an old clock somewhere in the walls, the whisper of wind through the eaves, the distant sound of a train passing through town. In the darkness, she could feel the weight of family history pressing down like a warm quilt. 4 generations of Whitfields had called this place home. Samuel's parents, Samuel himself, and now her and Tucker. The thought should have been comforting, but instead it felt like responsibility. She wasn't sure she was ready to carry. Tucker stirred beside her, murmuring something in his sleep. She reached over and smoothed his hair, the way she had every night since he was born. Tomorrow they would begin the work of making this place theirs. Tonight it was enough to be here, to be safe, to be home. Outside, Maple Street was quiet, except for the occasional car passing by and the soft rustle of leaves in the oak trees. This was their street now, their neighborhood, their life. Whatever challenges tomorrow brought, they would face them together in this old house that nobody else had wanted, but somehow felt like it had been waiting for them all along. Morning came too early, announced by a mockingbird who had apparently claimed the oak tree outside Tucker's window as his personal concert hall. Maggie woke to the sound of her son moving around upstairs, his footsteps careful on the old floorboards. "Mom!" Tucker's voice carried down the stairs. "The bathroom faucet makes a really weird noise. Everything in this house makes weird noises," Maggie called back, stretching the kinks out of her back. Sleeping on an air mattress was a young person's game, and at 52, she was definitely not young anymore. After quick showers and a breakfast of instant oatmeal and coffee from the ancient percolator they'd found in the kitchen, they began the work of assessment. Maggie had made a list the night before: immediate needs, eventual goals, and pipe dreams. The immediate needs list was already longer than her budget could handle. "Where do we start?" Tucker asked, surveying the front parlor with the critical eye of someone who'd helped move enough times to know the drill. "Let's figure out what we're working with," Maggie said. "You take measurements while I check the windows and walls." Tucker had inherited her practical nature along with her stubborn streak. While she tested window sashes and noted which ones were painted shut, he paced off the room dimensions and made notes in the small spiral notebook he carried everywhere. They worked in companionable silence, falling into the rhythm they'd developed. Over years of making the best of imperfect situations, it was Tucker who discovered the loose floorboard. "Mom, "This part sounds different," he said, stomping experimentally near the bay window. Instead of the solid thunk of wood on subflooring, his feet produced a hollow echo. Maggie knelt beside him and pressed her palms against the floorboards. 3 planks in a row moved slightly under pressure, as if they weren't properly nailed down. Probably just settling. Old houses do that. But Tucker was already on his hands and knees, running his fingers along the edges of the boards. "No! Look, these ones are cut different, like someone took them up and put them back." He was right. The wood grain didn't match the surrounding boards, and the edges had been sanded smooth instead of left with the rough saw marks visible everywhere else. Maggie found a kitchen knife and worked it carefully into the seam. The first board lifted, easily revealing a cavity between the floor joists. "There's something down there," Tucker whispered. Wrapped in oiled cloth and tied with string was a bundle about the size of a shoebox. Maggie lifted it out carefully, surprised by how light it felt. The cloth was old but well preserved, and someone had taken care to protect whatever was inside. "Should we open it?" Tucker asked. "It's our house now," Maggie said, though her hands hesitated over the knots. Something about finding hidden things felt like trespassing, even in their own home. The string came apart easily, and the cloth unfolded to reveal a bundle of letters held together with a faded blue ribbon. The envelopes were cream-colored and expensive-looking, addressed in careful cursive to Samuel Whitfield, 247 Maple Street, Millbrook, Georgia. The return address showed only R. Thompson and a post office box in Savannah. "Who's R. Thompson?" Tucker asked. Maggie turned over the bundle, noting the postmarks. The earliest letter was dated June 1962, the latest December 1973. 11 years of correspondence, hidden under the floorboards of Samuel's front parlor. "I don't know," she said. But Samuel thought they were important enough to hide. The first letter was 2 pages long, written in the same careful script as the address. It began simply, "My dearest Samuel," and ended with, "All my love, Rose." Between the greeting and signature was the kind of letter that made Maggie's chest tighten with recognition, the words of someone deeply, completely in love. "Rose Thompson," Maggie murmured, reading. "She talks about missing him, about counting the days until his next visit to Savannah." Tucker peered over her shoulder. "Was she his girlfriend?" "Sounds like it." Maggie scanned the letter quickly, catching phrases that painted a picture of secret meetings and carefully planned visits. "Listen to this. I understand why we must be careful, but sometimes I wish the whole world could know how much I love you." Why did they have to be careful? It was a good question, and one that made Maggie uncomfortable in ways she couldn't quite articulate. She'd grown up hearing stories about the South in the 1960s, but her family had always lived in the North. The reality of segregation, of laws that made love illegal based on the color of your skin, was academic history to her. But here was evidence that it had been personal reality for Samuel. "Different times," she said carefully. "People weren't always free to love who they wanted to love." They read through several more letters, and with each one, the picture became clearer. Rose wrote about her work at a school, about books she was reading, about dreams of traveling north where things are different. Samuel's side of the correspondence was missing, but Rose's responses painted him as thoughtful, gentle, and trapped by circumstances neither of them could control. "She sounds really smart," Tucker observed, after Maggie read aloud a passage about Rose's opinions on the Civil Rights Act. "She was a teacher," Maggie said, noting the sophisticated vocabulary and cultural references throughout the letters. "And, yes, very intelligent." The later letters carried a different tone. Where the early ones had been full of hope and plans for the future, these spoke of disappointment and growing distance. "I know you're trying to protect me," Rose wrote in one from 1971, "but silence isn't protection. It's just another kind of prison." The final letter, dated December 15th, 1973, was brief and heartbreaking. "I can't wait anymore, Samuel. I've accepted a position in Atlanta. Please don't try to find me. If you love me, let me go." Maggie sat back on her heels, the letters scattered around her on the floor. 11 years, she said. He kept her letters for 11 years after she left. Why did he hide them? Because no one was supposed to know. The voice came from the front porch, and Maggie looked up to see a woman in her 70s standing outside the screen door. She was small and bird-like, with silver hair pinned in a neat bun and eyes that missed nothing. Mrs. Henderson, Maggie guessed. That's right. Saw you two poking around yesterday. Figured I'd bring some welcome cookies. She held up a covered plate. Door was open, and I heard you talking about Rose's letters. Maggie stood, suddenly aware that they'd been reading private correspondence loud enough for neighbors to overhear. I'm sorry, we found these under the floorboards, and no need to apologize, honey. This is your house now, and those letters are part of its history. Mrs. Henderson stepped inside without invitation, the way only old-time neighbors could. Been wondering what happened to those. Samuel mentioned them once, years ago, when he was feeling poorly. You knew about Rose? Tucker asked. Mrs. Henderson's face softened as she looked at the letters scattered on the floor. I knew about a lot of things that happened in this town. Most of them aren't my stories to tell, but that one... She shook her head. That one. It broke my heart. What happened to her? Maggie asked. Rose Thompson was the finest teacher this county ever had, taught at the colored school until integration came, then moved to the new consolidated school. Smart as a whip, beautiful as a spring morning, and head over heels in love with your grandfather. But why did they have to hide it? Mrs. Henderson looked at Tucker with kind eyes. Because in 1962, a white man courting a black woman could get them both killed. Not legally. You understand? But there were ways. Your grandfather knew that, so did Rose. So they met in secret, wrote letters, dreamed of a time when things might be different. And that time never came? Maggie asked. Not for them. By the time the laws changed enough to matter, too much hurt had passed between them. Rose got tired of waiting for Samuel to find his courage, and Samuel got tired of asking her to wait. Mrs. Henderson picked up one of the letters, handling it with the reverence due a museum piece. She left town the week before Christmas, 1973. Samuel never spoke of her again, at least not to anyone I knew. The room fell silent, except for the tick of the old clock and the distant sound of traffic on Main Street. Maggie gathered the letters carefully, retying the blue ribbon that had held them for nearly 50 years. There's more, Mrs. Henderson said quietly. If you're planning to dig into family history, you should know there's more to find. What kind of more? The kind that explains why Samuel lived alone all those years, why he never remarried, why he left that house to you instead of your siblings. Mrs. Henderson's eyes were kind, but serious. Rose Thompson didn't just leave town, honey. She left with a secret that changed everything. Before Maggie could ask what she meant, Mrs. Henderson was heading for the door. I've said enough for one morning. You have my number if you need anything. And honey, she paused at the threshold. Be careful who you tell about those letters. Some folks in this town have long memories and short tempers about the old days. After she left, Maggie and Tucker sat in the front parlor, surrounded by the evidence of a love story that predated their birth, but somehow felt immediate and urgent. The house suddenly seemed less empty and more full of secrets, full of history, full of questions that demanded answers. Are we going to find out what happened? Tucker asked. Maggie looked at the letters in her lap, then at her son's earnest face. She thought about Mrs. Henderson's warning, about the implications of digging up family secrets in a small southern town, about the safe, quiet life she'd planned to build in this house. Yes, she said, we're going to find out everything. The Millbrook Public Library occupied a Carnegie building that had seen better decades, but the librarian, Miss Patricia Vance, ruled her domain with the efficiency of a field general and the warmth of a favorite aunt. When Maggie and Tucker arrived that afternoon with questions about local history, she practically rubbed her hands together with delight. Research project? She asked, leading them to a corner table stacked with bound volumes of the Millbrook Gazette dating back to 1955. Family history, Maggie said carefully. My grandfather lived here for most of his life, and we're trying to understand more about the town during the 1960s and 70s. Ms. Vance nodded knowingly. Turbulent times. Integration, civil rights, lots of changes happening fast. Your grandfather would have been a young man then. Samuel Whitfield, Tucker offered helpfully. Oh, Ms. Vance paused, her hand hovering over a volume from 1962. Samuel. Yes, I remember him. Quiet man, kept to himself mostly. Came in here every Tuesday for new books, always returned them exactly on time. She studied Maggie's face with new interest. You're his granddaughter, the one who inherited the house. News travels fast. In Millbrook, honey, news travels at light speed and gossip breaks the sound barrier. Miss Vance pulled out the 1962 volume and set it on the table. What specifically are you looking for? Maggie glanced at Tucker, who was already flipping through pages with the focused intensity he brought to anything involving puzzles or mysteries. We found some letters in the house, personal correspondence with someone named Rose Thompson. I was hoping to learn more about her. The change in Miss Vance's expression was subtle but unmistakable. A tightening around her eyes, a slight stiffening of her shoulders. Rose Thompson, now there's a name I haven't heard in years. You knew her? I knew of her. She taught at Lincoln Elementary. That was the colored school before integration. Brilliant woman from what I heard. Came here from Savannah in 1961. Fresh out of college, with more education than half the white teachers in the county. Tucker looked up from the newspaper. What happened to her? Miss Vance sat down across from them, lowering her voice even though the library was nearly empty. She left town suddenly in December 1973, just disappeared one day right before Christmas, left her teaching position, her apartment, everything. People said she'd gotten a better job in Atlanta, but she shrugged. Small towns always have theories. What kind of theories? Maggie asked. The kind that are probably better left buried. Miss Vance stood and walked to a filing cabinet near the reference desk. But if you're determined to dig into the past, you might find this interesting. She returned with a manila folder containing loose newspaper clippings and photocopied pages. The top clipping showed a group photograph of teachers at the newly integrated Millbrook Elementary School, dated September 1968. In the back row, third from the left, stood a young black woman with intelligent eyes and a dignified bearing that was unmistakable even in the grainy newsprint. Rose Thompson, Miss Vance said, pointing to the caption below the photo. Maggie stared at the image, comparing it to the photograph they'd found in Samuel's bedroom. Same woman, but this picture had been taken several years later. Rose looked older, more reserved, as if something had dimmed the light in her eyes. She's beautiful, Tucker said simply, inside and out from what people said. The children loved her. Even the white parents who'd been opposed to integration admitted she was an excellent teacher. Ms. Vance flipped to another clipping. She organized the first integrated Christmas pageant in 1969, got the Methodist and Baptist churches to work together on a community food drive. Real community builder. But she left suddenly? December 20th, 1973, gave her notice to the school board on a Friday, was gone by Monday. Principal at the time said it was for personal reasons. Ms. Vance's tone suggested she had opinions about those personal reasons that she wasn't sharing. Maggie spent the next hour reading through the newspaper archives while Tucker explored the children's section. The 1960s and early 70s in Millbrook read like a compressed history of the civil rights era. Peaceful protests, tense school board meetings, gradual changes that came too slowly for some and too quickly for others. Rose Thompson's name appeared frequently in the education coverage. She'd been active in teacher organizations, had written letters to the editor about curriculum improvements, and had been featured in a profile piece about New South educators in 1971. Reading between the lines, Maggie could see she'd been someone who pushed boundaries, always professional, always respectful, but never content to simply maintain the status quo. Found something interesting, Tucker said, appearing at her elbow with a thin book in his hands. It's a collection of local oral histories from 1975. Look at this. He'd bookmarked a page titled Voices from the Integration Years. Halfway down the page, Maggie found a quote attributed to a former teacher who asked not to be named. The hardest part wasn't the resistance from parents or the challenges in the classroom. The hardest part was the loneliness. Being one of only a few, carrying the weight of representing your entire race, never being able to just be yourself. And when you found someone who saw you as a person first, well, sometimes that made everything else even more complicated. "You think that's her?" Tucker asked. "Could be." Maggie reread the quote, hearing Rose's voice in the careful words and measured emotions. The timing fits. They were interrupted by the arrival of another patron, a man in his 70s with work-worn hands and overalls that had seen better years. He nodded politely to Miss Vance, then stopped short when he saw Maggie and Tucker at the research table. "You're Samuel's granddaughter," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir, Maggie Williams. This is my son, Tucker. James Washington." He offered his hand, which was warm and calloused from decades of honest work. "I knew your grandfather." "Good. Man, sorry for your loss." "Thank you. Were you friends?" "Acquaintances, mostly. We served together on the church building committee back in the 80s. James glanced at the newspapers, spread across the table, researching local history, learning about the town where my family lived, Maggie said carefully. James picked up the clipping with Rose's photograph, studying it with eyes that held recognition and something else, sadness, maybe, or regret. "Rose Thompson. Haven't seen this picture in years." "You knew her?" "My late wife Elnora taught at Lincoln Elementary before integration. Rose was her replacement when Elnora moved to the consolidated school." He set the clipping down gently. "Fine woman, real fine woman." "Do you know why she left so suddenly?" James looked around the library, noting Miss Vance's presence and the empty reading tables. "Some stories aren't for public telling," he said quietly. "But if you're truly interested in understanding your family's history, you might come by my house sometime. 412 Elm Street. I'm usually home afternoons." After he left, Miss Vance began gathering the newspaper volumes. "James is a good man," she said. "If he's willing to talk to you about Rose Thompson, you should listen. He knows things about this town that didn't make it into the newspaper." "What kind of things?" "The kind that happen in the spaces between what's reported and what's true." Miss Vance locked the volumes in a cabinet marked Local History Restricted Access. "Your grandfather wasn't the only white man in this town who admired Rose Thompson, but he might have been the only one who saw her as an equal." Walking home through the late afternoon heat, Maggie felt the weight of questions multiplying faster than answers. The photograph in her purse showed a woman who'd been loved by Samuel, respected by her colleagues, and mourned by people like James Washington. But she'd also been someone who'd left suddenly, carrying secrets that had shaped the rest of Samuel's life. "Mom," Tucker said as they turned onto Maple Street, "do you think Rose loved him back? From the letters?" "Yes, I think she did." "Then why didn't they get married?" It was the question Maggie had been avoiding, the one that cut to the heart of everything they'd learned today. Because sometimes loving someone isn't enough. Sometimes the world makes it impossible. "That's not fair." "No," Maggie agreed, looking at their house with its peeling paint and overgrown yard. "It's not fair at all, but maybe that's why we're here now. Maybe it's time for the story to have a different ending." That evening, as Tucker worked on homework at the kitchen table and Maggie unpacked their few belongings, she found herself returning again and again to Rose's photograph. Something about the woman's eyes suggested strength, intelligence, and a kind of patient endurance that spoke to experiences Maggie recognized. Tomorrow, she decided, they would visit James Washington. Tonight, she would read more of Rose's letters and try to understand how love could survive in the shadows, and what kind of secrets were worth hiding under the floorboards for 40 years. The basement of the Whitfield house had been calling to Maggie since their first day, but she'd been putting off the exploration. Basements in old houses were notorious for unpleasant surprises, foundation problems, water damage, or worse. But with Tucker safely at his first day of school and her own job not starting until Monday, she finally descended the creaking wooden stairs with a flashlight and a healthy dose of trepidation. What she found surprised her. Instead of the damp, cluttered storage space she'd expected, Samuel's basement was organized and purposeful. One corner had been converted into a workshop area with a proper workbench, pegboard for tools, and fluorescent lighting that still worked. When she flipped the switch, the opposite wall held floor-to-ceiling shelves lined with canning jars, their contents long since expired, but their labels still legible in Samuel's careful handwriting. But it was the third corner that made her catch her breath. Tucked behind the furnace, almost hidden from casual view, sat an old steamer trunk with brass corners and leather handles. The kind of trunk people used for long journeys, back when traveling meant weeks at sea and everything you owned had to fit in a few carefully packed containers. The trunk wasn't locked. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper and organized with the same precision Samuel had applied to everything else, Maggie found the fragments of a life lived largely in secret. Photographs, letters, newspaper clippings, and at the bottom, 3 leather-bound journals filled with Samuel's distinctive handwriting. The photographs told a story the family had never heard. Samuel and Rose together at what looked like a church picnic. She in a yellow sundress, he in a white shirt with rolled sleeves, both of them laughing at something beyond the camera's range. Another showed them walking along a riverbank, their hands almost but not quite touching. A third captured Rose reading under a tree while Samuel worked on what appeared to be a wooden birdhouse, hidden in plain sight, Maggie murmured, studying the backgrounds of the photos. These weren't secret meetings in dark corners. They were moments of happiness stolen in public places, disguised as chance encounters between a white man and a black woman who happened to be in the same place at the same time. The journals were revelatory. Samuel's voice came through in his private writings, thoughtful, conflicted deeply in love, but paralyzed by the social constraints of his time and place. The earliest entries from 1962 showed a young man grappling with feelings he'd never expected, saw Rose at the library. Today, she was reading Langston Hughes, completely absorbed. When she looked up and smiled, I felt something shift in my chest. This is dangerous territory. I know this, but I can't seem to stay away. Later entries documented their careful courtship, meetings, disguised as community events, conversations that had to be kept brief and public, the elaborate codes they developed for expressing feelings that couldn't be spoken aloud in a place where the wrong words could destroy lives. Rose suggested we might both enjoy the new exhibit at the County Museum. Separately, of course. Amazing how two people can view the same paintings at the same time without actually being together. We stood 3 feet apart, studying a landscape by someone named Monet, and she whispered that the water lilies reminded her of the pond behind her grandmother's house in Savannah. I wanted to tell her that everything beautiful reminds me of her, but there were other visitors nearby. The middle years of the journals showed a deepening relationship shadowed by increasing frustration. Samuel documented family pressure to marry a nice girl from a good family, community expectations he couldn't escape, and his own cowardice in the face of social censure. Rose asked me again today when I'm going to stop hiding. She's tired of pretending we're just acquaintances. When everyone in town knows we care for each other, she's right to be angry. I keep promising things will change, that I'll find a way for us to be together openly, but the truth is, I'm afraid. Not of losing my job or my place in the community. I'm afraid of what happens to her if people decide to make an example of us. The most heartbreaking entries came from 1973, as their relationship deteriorated under the weight of secrecy and unfulfilled promises. Samuel's writing grew increasingly desperate as he sensed Rose pulling away. She won't see me anymore. Says she can't keep living half a life, waiting for me to find courage I don't have. She's taken a position in Atlanta, a fresh start where nobody knows her history. I should be happy for her. I should let her go. But the thought of losing her feels like dying. The final entry was dated December 22nd, 1973, 2 days after Rose left town. She's gone. Drove past her apartment this morning and saw the landlord putting a "for rent" sign in the window. Mrs. Patterson at the school said Rose turned in her keys Friday and wished everyone a Merry Christmas, like she was just going away for the holidays. But her things are gone, her mailbox is empty, and I know she's not coming back. I've lost the only woman I'll ever love because I was too much of a coward to fight for her. Some mistakes you don't get to fix. Maggie sat back on her heels, surrounded by the evidence of a love story that had ended in heartbreak and regret. But there was something else in the trunk, something that suggested the story hadn't ended with Rose's departure. At the very bottom, wrapped in a hand-embroidered cloth, was a birth certificate. Grace Elizabeth Thompson, born April 15th, 1974, in Atlanta, Georgia. Mother, Rose Marie Thompson. Father, listed as unknown. The dates made Maggie's hands shake as she calculated backwards. If Grace had been born in April, Rose would have been pregnant when she left Millbrook in December. Pregnant with Samuels. A child, carrying a secret that would have destroyed them both if discovered in a small southern town in 1973. "Oh, Samuel," Maggie whispered. "You never knew." The sound of the front door slamming announced Tucker's return from school. Maggie quickly rewrapped the birth certificate and closed the trunk, her mind racing with implications. Samuel had spent 40 years believing he'd lost. Rose through his own cowardice, never knowing she'd left to protect not just herself, but their unborn child. "Mom?" Tucker's voice echoed down the basement stairs. "You down there?" "Coming up," she called, gathering the journals and heading for the stairs. "How was school?" "Weird," Tucker said when she emerged into the kitchen. "But not bad weird. Just different. The teacher seems nice, and there's another kid named Marcus who showed me where everything is." "That's good. Make any friends?" "Maybe." Marcus asked if I wanted to come to his house tomorrow after school. "His grandma makes cookies, apparently." Tucker studied her face with the perceptive gaze that always made her feel transparent. "You look like you found something important." "I did." Maggie set the journals on the kitchen table. "More of Samuel's story. It's complicated. The good kind of complicated or the bad kind? Both." Maggie opened the first journal to a page where Samuel had sketched Rose's profile in the margin. "Tucker, what would you say if I told you we might have family we've never met? Like cousins? Like an aunt? Samuel's daughter?" Tucker's eyes widened. He had kids? He might have. A daughter named Grace, born after Rose left town. She'd be your great-aunt. Where is she now? "I don't know, but I think we should try to find out." That evening, after Tucker had finished his homework and gone to bed, Maggie sat at the kitchen table reading Samuel's journals by lamplight. The man who emerged from these pages was nothing like the distant, taciturn grandfather she remembered from childhood visits. This Samuel was passionate, thoughtful, and deeply conflicted. A man who'd loved completely but lacked the courage to claim that love publicly. By the time she finished reading, she understood why he'd left the house to her instead of her siblings. Anton, Bree, and Jed had always been concerned with appearances, with family reputation, with maintaining the proper image. They would have sold the house immediately, scattered its secrets and buried its stories. But Maggie was different. She was the one who'd moved away, who'd built a life outside the constraints of small-town expectations, who'd raised a child, alone, and learned that love mattered more than other people's opinions. Samuel had somehow known she would be the one to handle his secrets with care, to see Rose's story as a love story rather than a scandal. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Maggie was hanging laundry on the line Samuel had strung, between two oak trees when a car pulled into the driveway. Her brother Anton climbed out, looking distinctly uncomfortable in his business suit and city shoes. "Anton, what are you doing here? Heard you were digging through Samuel's things," he said without preamble. "Thought I should check on how you're settling in." It was a lie, and they both knew it. Anton lived in Charlotte and hadn't visited Samuel. Once in the 5 years before he died. This wasn't a social call. "We're fine," Maggie said carefully. "Tucker started school yesterday. I start work Monday. Everything's on track." "Good, that's good." Anton picked up a clothespin that had fallen, turning it over in his hands. "Listen, Maggie, I've been thinking about the house situation. If you're having second thoughts about taking on such a big project, Bree and I could help you sell it. Split the proceeds 3 ways, fair and square. I'm not selling, but you haven't seen the inspection reports yet. The foundation needs work, the roof needs replacing, the electrical system is from the Eisenhower administration. You're looking at 50,000 in repairs, minimum. Where I choose to spend my money is my business." Anton's jaw tightened. "When? Your choices affect the family reputation. It becomes everybody's business. People are talking, Maggie, about you moving into that house, about what you might find there, about old stories that are better left alone." "What old stories?" "Nothing specific, just small-town gossip. You know how it is." But his eyes avoided hers, and Maggie realized with sudden clarity that Anton knew more than he was saying. "Did you know about Rose Thompson?" she asked. The clothespin snapped in Anton's hands. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Samuel's journals, the letters under the floorboards, the photographs in the basement." Maggie watched his face carefully. "You knew, didn't you? All these years, you knew he'd been in love with a black woman." "Keep your voice down," Anton hissed, glancing around as if neighbors might be listening. "Yes, I knew. We all knew. Daddy mentioned it once when he'd had too much to drink. Said Samuel had disgraced the family, consorting with that teacher woman. Said that's why Samuel never married, never had kids, lived like a hermit. Except he did have a child." Anton went very still. "What are you talking about?" "Rose was pregnant when she left. Had a daughter named Grace." "Your uncle had a child, Anton. We have family we've never met." "No." Anton stepped backward, shaking his head. "No, you need to stop this right now. If there's a child, if there's someone out there who could claim to be Samuel's heir, that changes everything. The will, the inheritance, all of it. So, this is about money. This is about protecting the family from scandal and legal complications. If you keep digging into Samuel's past, you're going to open a can of worms that affects all of us." Maggie folded her arms across her chest. "Then it's a good thing the house belongs to me, not us." Anton's mask of brotherly concern finally slipped, revealing the calculating businessman underneath. "Don't make me get lawyers involved, Maggie. I'll contest the will if I have to. Claim you influenced Samuel while he was sick, that you manipulated a dying old man. Samuel was sharp as a tack until the day he died, and you know it. Prove it." Anton straightened his tie and headed back to his car. "I'm giving you fair warning. Drop this investigation into Samuel's private life, sell the house, and take your share like a reasonable person. Keep pushing, and you'll wish you'd never heard of Rose Thompson." After he drove away, Maggie stood in the backyard surrounded by wet laundry and the smell of honeysuckle, understanding for the first time that finding Grace wouldn't just be about healing old wounds. It would be about fighting for the right to tell Samuel's story the way it deserved to be told, as a love story, not a scandal. And if her siblings wanted a fight, she was ready to give them one. The Millbrook County Clerk's office occupied the ground floor of a brick building that had housed various government functions since 1923. Maggie's first day of work began with Mrs. Dorothy Jenkins, the chief clerk, explaining the filing system with the gravity usually reserved for state secrets. "Everything pre-1980 is in the vault," Mrs. Jenkins said, leading Maggie through a maze of filing cabinets and record boxes. "Birth certificates, death certificates, marriage licenses, property deeds. If it happened in this county, we've got the paperwork somewhere." "How far back do the records go?" Maggie asked, thinking of Grace Thompson's birth certificate. to 1892, when the county was incorporated, though some of the older records are in rough shape, floods, fires, general wear and tear. Mrs. Jenkins unlocked a heavy door, marked "Authorized Personnel Only." "This is the vault. You'll be working here mostly, updating the database and cross-referencing old records with new ones." The vault was a climate-controlled room lined with metal shelves that stretched from floor to ceiling. Decades of paperwork chronicled the births, deaths, marriages, and property transfers of thousands of people who'd called Millbrook County home. It was exactly where Maggie needed to be. By lunchtime, she'd catalogued 2 boxes of 1950s birth certificates and had a good sense of the filing system. More importantly, she'd confirmed that the county kept copies of all birth certificates filed in Georgia, even for children born elsewhere to county residents. If Grace Thompson had any connection to Millbrook, there would be a record. "Taking to the work, okay?" Mrs. Jenkins asked when Maggie returned from lunch. "It's fascinating, actually. All these individual stories adding up to the history of a place." "That's one way to look at it. Most folks see it as just paperwork." Mrs. Jenkins handed her a box labeled Property Records 1970-1975. "You'll be scanning these this afternoon. Fair warning, some of the older documents are fragile, so handle them carefully." The property records told their own stories of a changing South. Integration had brought white flight to some neighborhoods and gradual integration to others. Maggie could trace the patterns in the deeds and transfers. Properties sold quickly and quietly, sometimes for less than their assessed value. As demographic changes shifted the social landscape, it was while scanning a 1974 deed transfer that she found the first surprise. Samuel Whitfield had owned more than just the house on Maple Street. In March 1974, 3 months before Grace's birth, he'd purchased a small house on Elm Street for $2,400 cash. According to the paperwork, he'd rented it to a tenant listed only as R. Thompson for exactly 1 year before selling it again. "Mrs. Jenkins?" Maggie called across the vault. "If someone rented a property, would there be additional records? Beyond the deed? Depends. Private landlords weren't required to file rental agreements back then, but if rent was paid by check, the bank records might show it." Mrs. Jenkins joined her at the scanning station. "What are you looking for?" "My grandfather owned rental property I didn't know about. Just curious about the history. Samuel Whitfield owned 6 properties around town at one time or another. Bought them cheap, fixed them up, either sold them or rented them out. Smart businessman, your grandfather. Never flashy about it, but he had a good eye for undervalued real estate." This was news to Maggie. The Samuel she remembered had lived modestly, driven an old pickup truck, and worn the same 3 flannel shirts in rotation. But the records painted a picture of someone who'd quietly accumulated significant assets over decades. "Do you know what happened to those properties?" "Sold most of them in the 80s and 90s. Few went to the church when he got older. Donated them for community housing or sold them cheap to young families just starting out." Mrs. Jenkins pulled out a thick folder. His lawyer might have more details. Walter Grayson handled most of Samuel's business, still practices law here in town. That evening, Maggie sat at the kitchen table with Tucker, helping him with math homework while her mind worked through the implications of Samuel's hidden real estate dealings. The timeline was too precise to be coincidental. He'd bought the Elm Street house just as Rose would have been showing, rented it to someone with her initials for exactly the time it would take her to have a baby and recover, then sold it again. "Mom, you're not paying attention," Tucker said, tapping his pencil against the table. "I asked you 3 times if this looks right." "Sorry, honey, let me see." She checked his long division, noting that he'd gotten every problem correct. "Perfect. You're getting good at this. It's easier than the old school," Mrs. Patterson explains. "With things better." Tucker closed his math book and studied his mother's distracted expression. "You found something else today, didn't you?" "How do you know?" "You get the same look when you're putting puzzle pieces together, like when you figured out why the rent kept going up in Detroit." Maggie smiled at her son's perceptiveness. I found out Samuel owned more property than anyone knew, including a house he rented to someone with Rose's initials right around the time Grace would have been born. So he knew about the baby, maybe. Or maybe he suspected. Maggie pulled out the folder of documents she'd photocopied. Either way, he tried to help her. That's good, right? That means he wasn't really a coward. It means he was human. He made mistakes, but he tried to do right when he could. The next day brought Maggie's first visit to the law office of Walter Grayson, attorney at law. The office occupied the second floor of a Victorian house that had been converted to professional suites, and Mr. Grayson himself was exactly what Central Casting would order for a small-town southern lawyer, white-haired, courtly, and sharp as a tack, despite being somewhere north of 70. "Miss Williams," he said, rising from behind a desk covered with legal documents, "I was wondering when you'd come to see me. You were expecting me. Your grandfather mentioned you specifically in our last conversation, said you were the one. In the family with enough sense to ask the right questions." He gestured to a leather chair across from his desk. "What can I help you with?" "I'm trying to understand Samuel's financial situation. The family was told he had very little beyond the house, but I've found evidence of other properties. Samuel was a very private man about his business affairs. Preferred to let people think he was just getting by rather than draw attention to his success." Mr. Grayson opened a filing cabinet and withdrew a thick folder. "He instructed me to share certain information with you if you asked, but only with you." "Why only me?" "Because you're the only one who moved away, built a life outside this town's social constraints. He felt you'd understand his choices without judging them." Mr. Grayson spread several documents across his desk. Property deeds, bank statements, and investment records painted a picture of a man who'd lived far below his means while quietly accumulating wealth. At the time of his death, Samuel owned 3 rental properties, had significant savings in multiple accounts, and held investments worth approximately $400,000, Mr. Grayson said. "All of it left to you, with the specific instruction that you were not to feel obligated to share it with your siblings." Maggie stared at the numbers, trying to process the magnitude of Samuel's bequest. $400,000 plus the house and its contents. Samuel was quite specific about the house, said you'd know what to do with what you found there. He knew I'd find the letters. He hoped you would. He also hoped you'd have the courage to act on what you discovered. Mr. Grayson handed her a sealed envelope with her name written in Samuel's careful script. "He left this for you to read when you were ready to hear the whole truth." Maggie's hands shook as she opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a small brass key. "Maggie, if you're reading this, it means you found Rose's letters and started asking questions. The key opens a safety deposit box at First National Bank, Box 247. Inside, you'll find everything I couldn't bring myself to throw away and couldn't bear to keep in the house. I pray you'll have the wisdom to know what to do with what you find." There, Rose was the love of my life, and my greatest regret is that I didn't have the courage to fight for her when it mattered. Don't make my mistakes. Some things are worth fighting for, no matter what it costs. Samuel. The safety deposit box contains additional documents about Rose Thompson, Mr. Grayson said quietly, and correspondence that arrived after Samuel's death. What kind of correspondence? Letters from Atlanta, from someone who'd been trying to find Samuel for several years. Maggie's heart stopped. "Grace, I believe so. Samuel never opened them, said he was too old and too afraid to learn whether his past mistakes had hurt someone else. But he instructed me to give them to you if you showed up asking the right questions. She's been looking for him, according to the postmarks. She's been writing to him for 3 years. The most recent letter arrived 2 weeks after his funeral." Maggie clutched the key in her palm, feeling the weight of decisions that would affect not just her own life, but Tucker's and Grace's as well. Samuel had left her more than money and property. He'd left her the chance to finish a story he'd been too afraid to complete. "Mr. Grayson," she said carefully. If Samuel had acknowledged Grace as his daughter during his lifetime, would she have had legal claims to his estate? Under Georgia law, yes. A biological child has inheritance rights regardless of the circumstances of their birth. And now it's complicated. The estate has been settled, the will has been probated. But if Grace could prove paternity and wanted to contest the distribution, he shrugged. It would be messy, but I inherited everything legally? Absolutely. Samuel's will is ironclad. He was very careful about that, which meant, Maggie realized, that she now had a choice Samuel had never allowed himself. She could reach out to Grace, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. She could complete the circle of love and family that Samuel had broken 40 years ago, not out of legal obligation, but out of moral conviction. "Mr. Grayson," she said, standing and shaking his hand, "I'll need directions to the bank." The safety deposit box at First National Bank held secrets that transformed everything Maggie thought she knew about her family's story. Walter Grayson accompanied her to the bank, his presence lending official weight to what felt like a sacred ritual. The bank manager, a nervous young man who clearly recognized the gravity of opening a box that had been sealed for decades, led them to a private viewing room. "Take all the time you need," he said, placing the metal box on the table and discreetly withdrawing. Inside, wrapped in acid-free tissue paper with the care of museum pieces, were the fragments of a love that had survived separation, silence, and time. More photographs showed Samuel and Rose in moments of unguarded happiness, laughing together at what appeared to be a church social, sharing a picnic lunch by a river, working side by side in a garden. But it was the manila envelope marked Grace that made Maggie's hands tremble. Rose's teaching certificate came first, signed and notarized in 1961, showing that she'd graduated summa cum laude from Spelman College with degrees in education and English literature. The document was pristine, as if Rose had treasured it as proof of her worth in a world that questioned her intelligence based on the color of her skin. "She was brilliant," Maggie whispered, studying the academic honors listed on the certificate. "Samuel always said she was the smartest person he'd ever met," Walter confirmed. "Said she could quote Shakespeare and solve calculus problems with equal ease." Beneath the certificate was Grace's birth certificate, the original, not the copy. Maggie had found in the basement trunk, and clipped to it was a hospital bracelet. "Baby girl Thompson, 4/15/74, 6 LBS 3 Oz. Mother, Rose M. Thompson." But it was the bundle of unopened letters that stopped Maggie's breath. 23 envelopes, all addressed to Samuel Whitfield in the same careful handwriting, all bearing return addresses from Grace Thompson at various Atlanta locations spanning 3 years. The postmarks told a story of persistent effort. 1. Letter every 2 months, like clockwork, from someone who refused to give up hope. "He never opened them," Walter said softly. "Said he was afraid of what they might contain, afraid he'd caused more harm than he knew, but he kept them. Samuel kept everything that mattered to him. He just couldn't always bring himself to face it." Maggie picked up the most recent letter, postmarked just 6 weeks ago. The return address showed Grace Thompson at an apartment complex in downtown Atlanta. She was still there, still trying to reach a father who had died without knowing. She existed. "Walter, I need to call her. I was hoping you'd say that." The drive back to Maple Street felt surreal, as if Maggie were floating through someone else's life. She'd left the house that morning as Samuel's granddaughter, inheritor of a modest property and some family mysteries. She was returning as the keeper of a love story that had shaped 2 lives and created a third, the guardian of secrets that could heal wounds or create new ones. Tucker was at Marcus Washington's house, James Washington's grandson, it turned out, which explained the boy's easy acceptance of newcomers. The house was quiet except for the tick of Samuel's old clock and the whisper of wind through the oak trees. Maggie sat at the kitchen table with Grace's letters spread before her, trying to summon the courage to break a silence that had lasted 23 years. She started with the oldest letter, dated 3 years earlier. Dear Mr. Whitfield, my name is Grace Thompson, and I believe you knew my mother, Rose Thompson, who taught school in Millbrook from 1961 to 1973. I'm writing because I'm trying to understand my family history, and your name appears in some of my mother's personal papers. She passed away last year after a long illness, and among her things I found letters and photographs that suggest you and she were close friends. I would very much like to speak with you about those years if you're willing. It can be reached at the address above or by phone at 404-555-7823. Respectfully, Grace Thompson. The letters that followed showed Grace's growing frustration and determination. She'd done her own research, found records of Samuel's property ownership in Millbrook, discovered the Elm Street house rental that coincided with her birth. By the 10th letter, she was asking direct questions. Mr. Whitfield, I found the rental agreement for 247 Elm Street, dated March 1974. The tenant is listed as R. Thompson, and the lease term matches exactly with the months surrounding my birth. I know this seems forward, but I have to ask, were you and my mother more than friends? Did you know about me? I'm not looking for money or anything like that. I just want to understand where I come from. The final letter, written just 2 weeks before Samuel's death, was heartbreaking in its simple honesty. Mr. Whitfield, this is my 23rd letter to you over 3 years. I don't know if you're receiving them, if you're unable to respond, or if you simply choose not to. I understand that my questions might be painful or unwelcome, but I'm running out of hope, and I need you to know that I don't judge whatever happened between you and my mother. She spoke of you with love until the day she died, said you were a good man caught in impossible circumstances. If you are my father, I want you to know that I've had a good life, that Rose raised me to be proud of who I am, and that I would be honored to meet you. If you're not, I apologize for bothering you all these years, but please, if you have any information about my mother's time in Millbrook, I would be grateful for anything you could share. She told me so little about those years, and now she's gone. You're my last connection to that part of her life. Grace. Maggie wiped tears from her cheeks, understanding finally why Samuel had been too afraid to open these letters. Grace wasn't asking for money or making demands. She was simply a daughter looking for her father, a woman trying to understand the love story that had created her. The phone call would have to wait until evening, when Tucker was home and could be part of this moment. But first, Maggie needed to prepare him for what was coming, and she needed to warn Grace that her father was gone, that the reunion she'd been hoping for would have to happen through the family he'd left behind. When Tucker returned from Marcus's house with grass stains on his knees and a gap-toothed grin, Maggie was ready with hot chocolate and the kind of serious conversation that marked turning points in a child's life. Tucker, sit down. I have something important to tell you about our family. He settled at the kitchen table, noting the letters spread across its surface. More secrets. The biggest one. Samuel had a daughter named Grace. She's been trying to find him for 3 years, but he died before they could meet. Tucker studied the letters with the same careful attention he brought to math problems. She's really our family. She's really our family, your great-aunt, my aunt, and she lives in Atlanta, just 2 hours away. Are we going to call her? If you want to. But Tucker, this changes things. If we bring Grace into our lives, people in this town are going to have opinions. Some of them won't be nice. Tucker was quiet for a long moment, processing implications that were beyond his years, but not beyond his understanding. Finally, he looked up with the clear-eyed certainty that children possessed before the world taught them to doubt themselves. Mom, you always told me family isn't just about blood. It's about people who love you and take care of you and want good things for you. That's right. So if Grace is family, and if Samuel loved her mother, then calling her isn't about what other people think. It's about doing what's right. Sometimes, Maggie reflected, 10-year-olds had a clearer understanding of morality than adults who'd spent decades learning to compromise their principles. You're absolutely right. Besides, Tucker added with a grin, Marcus says his grandpa thinks you're the bravest person he's ever met, says it takes courage to move to a new place and start over. James Washington said that. Uh-huh. He told Marcus that people who run away from hard things stay weak, but people who face hard things get stronger. He says that's what you're doing, facing hard things to make them better. That evening, as the sun set behind the oak trees and filled the kitchen with golden light, Maggie dialed Grace Thompson's number. The phone rang 3 times before a woman's voice answered, cautious but hopeful. Hello? Grace? This is Maggie Williams. I'm Samuel Whitfield's granddaughter, and I'm calling about your letters. The silence that followed was filled with 23 years of waiting, 3 years of unanswered correspondence, and a lifetime of questions about identity and belonging. When Grace finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. Is Samuel still alive? No, honey. He passed away 2 months ago. I'm so sorry. Grace's quiet sob carried across the phone line. Grief for a father she'd never known, and a reunion. That would never happen. But when she spoke again, her voice carried something else, relief maybe, or hope. Did he know about me? He suspected. And Grace? He loved your mother until the day he died. We found the letters, the photographs, everything he kept hidden all these years. He never stopped loving her. I'd like to meet you, Grace said, if that's possible. I'd like to hear about him, about the family I never knew I had. We'd like that too. Both of us, my son Tucker and me. We're living in Samuel's house now, trying to piece together the story of what really happened between him and your mother. Would it be all right if I came to Millbrook? I've never seen the town where my mother lived, never seen the house where she and Samuel... Grace, Maggie interrupted gently. You're welcome here any time. This is your father's house. That makes it your home too. After they hung up with plans for Grace to visit the following weekend, Maggie sat in the growing darkness with Tucker beside her, both of them quiet with the magnitude of what they'd just set in motion. Are you scared? Tucker asked. Terrified, Maggie admitted, but also excited. We're about to meet the person who can tell us the rest of Rose's story. And Samuel's story too, and our story, because we're all part of it now. Outside, the mockingbird in the oak tree began his evening. Serenade, singing songs he'd learned from other birds, other places, other times. Tomorrow, Maggie would have to tell James Washington about Grace's visit, prepare for whatever community reaction might follow, and figure out how to introduce a black woman to a small southern town as Samuel Whitfield's daughter. But tonight, for the first time since inheriting the house, she felt like they were exactly where they belonged. Grace Thompson arrived in Millbrook on a Saturday morning in October, driving a sensible Honda Civic and carrying a leather portfolio that Maggie suspected contained decades of questions and carefully preserved memories. She was smaller than Maggie had expected, with Rose's intelligent eyes and Samuel's careful way of observing before speaking. At 49, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who'd learned early that first impressions mattered more for some people than for others. Tucker answered the door before Grace could knock, his natural curiosity overcoming any adult awkwardness about meeting family members for the first time. You look like the picture, he said simply, the one of your mum when she was young. Grace smiled, and in that expression Maggie saw echoes of Samuel's rare moments of unguarded joy. You must be Tucker. I've been looking forward to meeting you. Mum made cookies, Tucker announced, and she cleaned the house twice, which was probably unnecessary since it was already pretty clean. Tucker, Maggie said, appearing behind him with her hands still dusted with flour. Let Grace come inside before you start sharing all our family business. It's okay, Grace said, stepping into the front hall and looking around with the wide-eyed wonder of someone seeing a childhood story made real. This is exactly how I imagined it. The staircase, the crown molding, even the light coming through those windows. Mother described it so perfectly, I feel like I've been here before. They spent the morning in the kitchen, sharing coffee and stories, while Tucker divided his attention between Grace's photo albums and the plate of chocolate chip cookies. Grace had brought 3 decades of documentation, photographs of Rose teaching in Atlanta, copies of letters Rose had written to friends about her time in Millbrook, and most surprisingly, a wooden jewelry box that Rose had treasured until her death. She always said this was the most beautiful thing anyone had ever made for her, Grace said, opening the box to reveal the delicate craftsmanship. Hand-carved cherry wood with dovetail joints and a musical mechanism that plays Für Elise. She told me a friend made it for her birthday one year, but she never said who. Maggie ran her fingers over the smooth wood, recognizing the style from Samuel's workshop in the basement. He made this for her. I thought so. When I was little, I used to sit on her bed and watch her wind it up every night before putting her earrings away. She'd get this faraway look on her face, like she was remembering something precious. She kept his gift all those years. She kept everything that reminded her of being loved. Grace pulled out a manila envelope, including these. The envelope contained photographs Maggie had never seen. Samuel and Rose together at what appeared to be a church social, him reading while she graded papers under a tree, both of them laughing at something beyond the camera's view. But it was the last photograph that made Maggie's breath catch, Samuel touching Rose's slightly rounded belly, while she smiled with the secret joy of early pregnancy. He knew, Grace whispered. Look at his face. He knew about me. The photograph was dated November 1973, just 1 month before Rose left Millbrook. Samuel's expression showed wonder, protective tenderness, and something that might have been fear. His hand rested gently on the small curve that would become Grace, and his eyes held the look of a man who discovered he had everything to lose. Why didn't he marry her? Tucker asked with the blunt honesty of childhood. If he loved her and knew about the baby, why didn't he just marry her? Grace and Maggie exchanged glances, both understanding that answering Tucker's question meant explaining a world where love wasn't always enough to overcome social boundaries. It's complicated, Grace said carefully. In 1973, interracial marriage was legal, but that didn't mean it was accepted, especially in small southern towns. But people did it anyway, right? If they really loved each other? Some people did. But it meant giving up everything, family, community, sometimes jobs and safety. And if you had children, Grace's voice caught. Mixed-race children face their own challenges. Some parents thought love meant protecting their children from that kind of hardship. Tucker considered this with the seriousness he brought to all moral questions. But you turned out okay. I did. But I also grew up in Atlanta, where there were other families like ours, where being different wasn't as dangerous as it might have been in a place like this. Maggie studied the photograph, trying to imagine the conversation that must have preceded Rose's departure. Samuel knowing he was about to become a father, but unable to see a path that wouldn't endanger the woman he loved, and the child they'd created together. Grace, did your mother ever tell you what happened? Why she left when she did? Not directly, but when she got sick last year, near the end, she talked more about those days. She said Samuel begged her to stay, promised he'd find a way to make it work, but she was scared, not for herself, but for the baby. There had been incidents, threats, anonymous letters telling her to leave town. Someone put a brick through her apartment window with a note attached. What did the note say? We know what you are. We know what you're doing. Leave before something happens that can't be undone. The room fell silent, except for the tick of Samuel's old clock. Maggie understood now why Rose had made the heartbreaking choice to leave the man she loved. It wasn't just about social disapproval or family pressure. It was about survival, so she left to protect you, Tucker said. And to protect Samuel, too. That's what I think. Mother always said love sometimes means making the hardest choice, even when it breaks your heart. Grace opened her portfolio and withdrew a thick bundle of papers. There's something else, something I didn't know how to tell you over the phone. The papers were legal documents, property deeds, bank statements, and a will dated 6 months before Rose's death. As Maggie scanned through them, the scope of Rose's hidden legacy became clear. She owned property in Atlanta, Grace said. Quite a bit of it. Started with a small house Samuel helped her buy when I was born, then added more over the years. By the time she died, she had accumulated nearly $500,000 in real estate. Samuel helped her buy property. Look at the down payment records. Every house, every investment, the money came from wire transfers from a bank account. In Millbrook, Samuel had been sending her money for 40 years. Maggie stared at the bank records, seeing transaction after transaction. $500 here, $1,000 there, steady support that had allowed Rose to build a secure life for herself and Grace in Atlanta. Samuel hadn't just loved Rose and lost her. He'd spent 4 decades quietly ensuring her financial security, supporting the child he'd never been able to acknowledge publicly. "He took care of you," she whispered. "All those years, he made sure you and your mother had what you needed. More than that." Grace pulled out the final document, a letter in Rose's handwriting, dated just weeks before her death. "She left this for me to find after she was gone. She wanted me to know the truth about Samuel, about why she left, and about why she never tried to contact him again." Maggie read Rose's final letter with growing amazement. "My dearest Grace, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and you're finally learning about the man who loved us both enough to let us go. Samuel Whitfield was the best man I ever knew, and leaving him was the hardest thing I ever did. But I did it because I knew that staying would destroy him, and probably us too. The money he sent over the years wasn't obligation or guilt. It was love, pure and simple. He wanted to take care of us even when he couldn't be with us. I never contacted him again because I was afraid that seeing me would only reopen wounds that needed to heal. But now that I'm dying, I want you to know that not a day passed that I didn't think of him, that I didn't wonder if we'd made the right choice. Find him if you can, Grace. Tell him I never stopped loving him. Tell him I was proud to carry his child, proud to raise his daughter, proud to have been loved by someone so completely good. Your mother Rose, she never stopped loving him," Grace said, tears streaming down her cheeks. 40 years, and she never stopped loving him. Tucker had gone very quiet, processing the magnitude of a love story that spanned decades and survived. Separation, silence, and death. Finally, he looked up with the clarity that children brought to adult complexities. "They were both brave," he said. "Samuel was brave to love her even when it was dangerous, and Rose was brave to leave even when it broke her heart. And they were both brave to keep loving each other even when they couldn't be together." "Yes," Maggie said, understanding finally. Why Samuel had left the house to her, why he'd hidden these secrets, but preserved them carefully, why he'd trusted her to find Grace and complete the story he'd been too afraid to finish. They were both brave, and now it's our turn to be brave. 2. Grace wiped her eyes and looked around the kitchen where her parents had shared secret moments of happiness 50 years earlier. "What do you mean?" "I mean Samuel spent 40 years regretting that he didn't have the courage to fight for love. When it mattered, he made sure you and Rose were taken care of, but he never got to be your father. He never got to meet his granddaughter through marriage, never got to hold his great-grandson." Maggie reached across the table and took Grace's hand. "But we can give him something he never got to have. We can be the family he always wanted, openly and proudly, no matter what anyone else thinks about it. People in this town won't like it," Grace said quietly. "Some won't," Maggie agreed. "But some will, and the ones who matter will understand that love is love, and family is family, regardless of what happened 50 years ago." Tucker raised his hand like he was in school. "I vote yes for Grace being our family officially." "It's not up for a vote, honey. She already is our family." "Good," Tucker said with satisfaction, "because I've always wanted an aunt, And besides, if people have problems with it, they can talk to Marcus's grandpa. He says anyone who judges people by the color of their skin instead of the content of their character is missing the whole point of being human. Grace laughed through her tears. I like this kid. He's got good instincts, Maggie said, just like his great-grandfather did. Outside, the October light was turning golden, painting the kitchen in warm hues that made everything feel possible. Tomorrow, Maggie would have to figure out how to introduce Grace to the community as Samuel's daughter, how to navigate the social complexities of a small southern town, and how to protect the family they were building from whatever storms might come. But today, for the first time in 50 years, Samuel Whitfield's daughter was sitting in his kitchen, surrounded by people who loved her, learning about the father who'd never stopped caring for her. It wasn't the reunion he'd dreamed of, but it was the healing he'd hoped for, and sometimes, Maggie reflected, that was enough to transform everything. News traveled fast in Millbrook, but Grace's presence traveled faster. By Sunday afternoon, Maggie's phone had rung 6 times, twice from nosy neighbors wanting to know about the visitor, once from Mrs. Henderson checking to make sure everything was all right, and 3 times from her siblings demanding explanations. The call from Bree was the most direct. Maggie, people are saying you have a black woman staying at the house claiming to be family. Please tell me this is just gossip. It's not gossip, Maggie said, watching through the kitchen window as Grace and Tucker worked together in Samuel's garden, pulling weeds and harvesting the last of the autumn vegetables. Grace Thompson is Samuel's daughter, our aunt. The silence, on Bree's end, stretched long enough that Maggie wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, her sister spoke in the tight voice she used when trying to control her temper. That's impossible. Samuel never had children. Samuel had a relationship with a woman named Rose Thompson in the 1960s and 70s. Grace was born in 1974, and we have documentation proving Samuel knew about her and supported her financially for 40 years. Even if that's true, and I'm not saying it is, it doesn't make this woman family. Not legally. It makes her family in every way that matters. Maggie, listen to me carefully. Anton has already talked to his lawyer about contesting Samuel's will. If there's someone out there claiming to be his heir, that gives him grounds to challenge the entire estate distribution. Grace isn't claiming anything. She doesn't want money or property. She just wanted to know her father. But now that she knows about the inheritance, that could change. Bree's voice carried the calculating tone that had always made Maggie uncomfortable. You need to be very careful about what you tell this woman and what kind of promises you make. The only promise I've made is that she's welcome in her father's house, a house you might not own much longer if Anton has his way. After Bree hung up, Maggie sat at the kitchen table with Samuel's journals, reading his words and trying to understand how love could be so complicated that it took 50 years to reach resolution. Grace appeared in the doorway with dirt under her fingernails and Samuel's gardening gloves still on her hands. Everything okay? You look upset. Family drama. My siblings are not pleased about your existence. Grace pulled off the gloves and washed her hands at the sink, her movements careful and deliberate. I can leave if my being here causes problems for you. Absolutely not. This is your home, as much as it is ours. But if they contest the will, let them try. Maggie's voice carried more confidence than she felt. Samuel left everything to me for a reason. He knew what he was doing. Monday morning brought unwelcome visitors. Maggie was getting ready for work when a black BMW pulled into the driveway, followed by a second car she didn't recognize. Anton climbed out of the BMW, along with a man in an expensive suit who was obviously a lawyer. From the second car emerged Jed and a woman with a briefcase who screamed legal authority. Family meeting, Tucker observed from the kitchen window. More. Like an ambush, Maggie muttered, checking her watch. She was supposed to be at the courthouse in 30 minutes, but this conversation couldn't wait. Grace had spent the night in Samuel's room, her father's room. and was just coming downstairs when the front door erupted in authoritative knocking. She paused on the landing, taking in the scene below with the careful assessment of someone who'd learned to read situations quickly. "You must be Grace," Anton said when Maggie opened the door. His tone was polite but cold, the voice of someone conducting unwelcome business. "I'm Anton Williams, Maggie's brother. These are our attorneys." "Ms. Thompson," the first lawyer said, extending his hand. "I'm David Hartwell, representing the Williams family in estate matters. We'd like to ask you a few questions if you don't mind." "I do mind, actually," Grace said, coming down the stairs with quiet dignity. "I'm a guest in this house, not a defendant in a legal proceeding." "Nobody's suggesting you're a defendant," the second lawyer said. "We're simply trying to understand the circumstances of your relationship to the deceased." "Samuel Whitfield was my father," Grace said simply. "I have documentation proving that relationship, including 40 years of financial support that demonstrates his acknowledgement of paternity." Anton's face went very still. "What kind of documentation?" Grace looked at Maggie, who nodded encouragement. "Bank records showing regular payments from Samuel's account to my mother's account in Atlanta. Property deeds showing he helped finance her first house purchase. Personal correspondence indicating he knew about my birth and took responsibility for our welfare. But no formal acknowledgement," Hartwell pressed. "No legal documents naming you as his heir or beneficiary." "No, but then again, your client inherited everything without formal acknowledgement either. Samuel's will simply names Maggie as his sole beneficiary. It doesn't specifically exclude other potential heirs." The lawyers exchanged glances that Maggie didn't like. "Ms. Thompson," the second attorney said, "would you be willing to undergo DNA testing to establish paternity?" "I would," Grace said without hesitation. "Would you be willing to undergo testing to establish your client's relationship to Samuel?" "That's different. The Williams siblings' relationship to Samuel is well documented." "So is mine," Grace said calmly. "I have birth certificates, school records, medical files, and 40 years of financial documentation. What I don't have is a reason to challenge Samuel's will or claim his property. I came here to learn about my father, not to take anything from his family." "But you are his family," Tucker said from the kitchen doorway. "That's the whole point." Anton's eyes fixed on Tucker with an expression that made Maggie step protectively closer to her son. "This doesn't concern children." "It concerns me," Tucker said with the stubborn courage that had gotten him through 3 different schools and half a dozen difficult transitions. "Grace is my great-aunt. This is her family too." "Tucker, go finish getting ready for school," Maggie said quietly. "I want to hear this, now." After Tucker reluctantly headed upstairs, Maggie turned to her siblings and their legal representation. "You have exactly 5 minutes to say whatever you came here to say. Then I want you off my property." "Maggie, be reasonable," Jed said, speaking. "For the first time. This situation affects all of us. If Samuel had another heir, that changes the legal standing of his will. Only if that heir contests the will, which Grace has made clear she won't do." "People change their minds," Hartwell said, "especially when they realize how much money is involved." "What's that supposed to mean?" Grace asked. "It means," Anton said, abandoning any pretense of politeness, "that you showing up now, right after Samuel's death, claiming to be his daughter, looks suspiciously like opportunism." The kitchen went very quiet. Grace studied Anton with the same careful attention she'd been giving Samuel's photographs, as if trying to understand how the same family could produce such different approaches to love and loyalty. "Mr. Williams," she said finally, "I've been trying to contact Samuel for 3 years. I have postal receipts for 23 letters I sent to this address, all returned unopened. If I were an opportunist, don't you think I would have tried harder to establish contact while he was alive?" "Maybe you knew he was sick. I knew he was old. I didn't know he was dying." Grace's voice carried a sadness that was unmistakable. "And I certainly didn't know he'd been supporting my mother and me for 40 years. I found out about that after his death, when I inherited my mother's papers. Maggie had heard enough. Grace has DNA from Samuel, hair from his brush, which I gave her permission to take. If you want paternity testing, we'll do it. But when it proves what we already know, I want formal apologies from all of you. And if it doesn't prove what you think it proves, Hartwell asked, then Grace is still welcome in this house as my friend and my son's adopted aunt, Maggie said firmly. But it will prove what we know, because Samuel kept 40 years of documentation about his relationship with Rose Thompson and his support of their daughter. Documentation you would have found if you'd ever bothered to really know your grandfather, instead of just waiting for him to die. The lawyers gathered their briefcases, clearly recognizing that they'd gotten all the information they were going to get. But Anton lingered, studying the kitchen with the calculating gaze of someone appraising property values. "This is a nice house," he said to Grace. "Must be tempting inheriting a place like this." "I didn't inherit it," Grace said quietly. "Maggie did. And from what I can see, she's taking excellent care of Samuel's legacy. His real legacy is his family name. The reputation he built in this community over 70 years. That legacy could be damaged by complications, by having a black daughter, you mean, by having family secrets that embarrass the people who still live here." Grace smiled, and for a moment Maggie saw Samuel in her expression, the quiet strength that had carried him through decades of loving someone he couldn't claim publicly. "Mr. Williams," Grace said, "I'm a retired high school principal from Atlanta. I have a master's degree in education, a spotless professional record, and the respect of everyone who knows me. If your family's reputation is damaged by being connected to me, that says more about your family than it does about mine." After they left, Maggie and Grace sat in the sudden quiet of the kitchen, both feeling the weight of lines drawn and battles that would have to be fought. "I'm sorry," Maggie said. "I knew they'd be difficult, but that was worse than I expected." "I've faced worse," Grace said simply. "What worries me is how this affects you and Tucker. You're the ones who have to live in this community. We're the ones who choose to live in this community. There's a difference." "Is there? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like your siblings are going to make life very difficult for you. If you continue to acknowledge me as family, then we'll deal with difficult." Maggie poured coffee for both of them, her hands steady despite the turmoil in her chest. "Grace, Samuel spent 40 years regretting that he didn't have the courage to fight for what mattered. I'm not making the same mistake, even if it costs you the house, especially if it costs me the house, because the house is just wood and nails and old memories. Family is what lasts." Grace was quiet for a long moment, studying her coffee cup, with the same careful attention she'd been giving everything else since arriving in Millbrook. "Rose told me once that love requires faith," she said finally. "Faith that doing the right thing will work out somehow, even when you can't see how. Do you have that faith?" "I'm learning to." Grace looked around the kitchen that had belonged to her father, the man she'd never met but had been supporting her entire life. Samuel had faith that you'd know what to do with his secrets. Maybe it's time I had the same faith. That afternoon, James Washington appeared at Maggie's front door with a covered dish and the kind of determined expression that suggested he had something important to say. Grace was at the courthouse with Maggie, helping to research property records and getting a feel for the community that had shaped her parents' love story. "Mr. Washington," Maggie said, inviting him into the front parlor, "this is a nice surprise. Call me James, please. And this isn't entirely a social visit." He set down what appeared to be a casserole and settled into Samuel's old armchair with the ease of someone who'd been welcomed in this house before. "Words getting around town about your visitor. Good word or bad word? Both. Depends on who's doing the talking." James studied the room, taking in the changes Maggie and Tucker had made. Fresh flowers on the mantel, family photographs on the side tables, signs of life returning to a house that had been too quiet for too long. "Grace seems like a fine woman," She is. Samuel would have been proud to know her. He was proud to know her. He just couldn't say so publicly. Maggie looked up sharply. You knew about Grace? I suspected. Samuel and I served on the church building committee for 3 years. Man talks when he's working with his hands, shares things he might not say in regular conversation. James's weathered hands smoothed the fabric of his work pants. He mentioned having family in Atlanta he couldn't visit. Talked about a young woman who'd grown up to be a teacher like her mother. Said he was proud of how she'd turned out, even though he'd never gotten to tell her so. He talked about Grace? Never by name. But he'd get a certain look when those letters came from Atlanta, hopeful and scared at the same time, like a man who wanted to open a door but was afraid of what he might find on the other side. Why didn't you ever ask him about it directly? Because some secrets aren't yours to dig into. Samuel would have told me if he'd wanted me to know. James reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew a small wrapped package. But he did give me something to hold for him. Said if anything ever happened to him, and if his granddaughter came asking the right questions, I should pass it along. Inside the tissue paper was a wooden cross, hand-carved with intricate detail work that spoke of hours of patient craftsmanship. On the back, in Samuel's careful script, was an inscription, for grace, faith, hope, and love. The greatest of these is love. Your father. Maggie's eyes filled with tears as she traced the delicate carving. He made this for her. Finished. It about 6 months before he died. Brought it to me and said he wasn't sure he'd have the courage to give it to her himself, but he wanted her to have it someday. James's voice was gentle. Said it was important for children to know their parents loved them, even when circumstances made that love hard to express. James, there's something you should know. My siblings are threatening to contest Samuel's will. They're claiming Grace might try to take part of the inheritance. That's foolishness, maybe, but they've got lawyers, and lawyers have a way of making simple things complicated. James was quiet for a moment, considering. Maggie, there are things about this town's history that don't make it into the official records. Things about what happened to people who challenged the social order back in the 60s and 70s. What kind of things? The kind that explain why Samuel was so afraid to claim Rose publicly, and why Rose was right to be scared for her safety. James's expression grew serious. There were men in this town, some of them still alive today, who didn't take kindly to integration, to civil rights, to the idea that black and white folks might be equals. Are you saying Grace could be in danger? I'm saying there are people who remember the old days and didn't much like how they ended. Your siblings stirring up legal trouble, bringing attention to Samuel's relationship with Rose, that could open old wounds some folks would rather keep covered. Maggie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that if you're determined to stand by Grace, and I think you should be, you need to understand that you're not just fighting for family recognition. You're fighting against 50 years of people who've been comfortable pretending that love like Samuel and Rose's didn't exist in their community. But things have changed. We have a black president now. Interracial couples are accepted. In cities, maybe. In places like Atlanta and Charlotte. But Millbrook, James shook his head. Change comes slow to small towns, and some people resist it every step of the way. That evening, Grace returned from the courthouse with a stack of photocopied documents and a troubled expression. She'd spent the afternoon researching not just Samuel's property holdings, but the town's history during the civil rights era. Did you know, she said, spreading newspapers clippings across the kitchen table, that in 1969, 3 black families who'd moved into previously all-white neighborhoods had their houses burned down, all within a 6-month period? Maggie studied the clippings, noting the careful language used to describe the incidents as accidental fires and electrical problems. And in 1971, Grace continued, a black teacher at the integrated high school was beaten so badly he required hospitalization. The official report said he was mugged by unknown assailants, but the hospital records show injuries consistent with an organized attack by multiple people. Grace, what are you getting at? I'm getting at the fact that my mother didn't leave just because of social pressure. She left because staying might have gotten her killed. Grace picked up one of the newspaper clippings. And here's the really interesting part. 3 of the men questioned in connection with these incidents are still alive. One of them is married to your brother Anton. The kitchen seemed to grow smaller and colder as the implications sank in. Maggie thought about Anton's visit that morning, his calculating assessment of the house, his obvious discomfort with Grace's presence. So when my siblings threaten legal action, Maggie said slowly, they're not just protecting their inheritance. They're protecting family secrets that go back 50 years. That's what I think. And if they're willing to contest Samuel's will to keep those secrets buried, they might be willing to do other things too. Like what? Like making sure I disappear again, permanently this time. Tucker chose that moment to come downstairs looking for a bedtime snack, and both women quickly gathered up the disturbing newspaper clippings. But he'd caught enough of the conversation to understand that the family drama was more serious than simple inheritance disputes. "Are we in trouble?" he asked with the directness that cut through adult evasions. "We might be," Maggie said, deciding that honesty was better than false reassurance. "Some people in this town don't like the idea of Grace being part of our family. Because she's black. Because her relationship to Samuel proves that love doesn't always follow the rules some people think are important." Tucker considered this while making himself a peanut butter sandwich. "So what do? We stick together," Grace said firmly, "and we trust that doing the right thing will work out somehow, even if it's dangerous. Especially if it's dangerous. Because courage isn't about not being scared. It's about being scared and doing the right thing anyway." Later that night, after Tucker had gone to bed and Grace was reading in Samuel's room, Maggie sat in the front parlor with the wooden cross. James had delivered. Samuel's final gift to his daughter was simple and profound, a declaration of love that had taken 50 years to deliver. Tomorrow, she would give Grace the cross and tell her about James's warnings. Tomorrow, they would have to decide how much they were willing to risk to give Samuel's love story the ending it deserved. But tonight, for the first time since inheriting the house, Maggie understood why Samuel had chosen her as his heir. It wasn't just because she was practical or independent or good with money. It was because she was the one family member who would fight for love over reputation, truth over comfort, doing right over doing easy. The house settled around her with its familiar creaks and whispers, and Maggie felt the weight of 4 generations of Whitfield history pressing down like a promise. Tomorrow would bring whatever challenges it brought, but tonight Samuel's daughter was sleeping in his room, surrounded by the love that had shaped her entire life from a distance, and sometimes that was enough to make courage possible. Victorian. DNA results arrived on a Thursday morning via certified mail, official and undeniable. Maggie signed for the envelope with hands that trembled slightly, knowing that whatever was inside would either validate everything they'd discovered or destroy the family they'd been building. Grace was in the kitchen making coffee when Maggie returned from the mailbox. Tucker had already left for school, chattering excitedly about a science project he was working on with Marcus Washington. The normalcy of the morning routine felt surreal against the weight of the envelope in Maggie's hands. "The results?" Grace asked, noting the return address from the medical laboratory. "Should we wait for Tucker? He's 10 years old. He shouldn't have to carry the weight of adult decisions." Grace poured coffee into 2 mugs with steady hands. "Besides, whatever those papers say doesn't change what we know in our hearts." Maggie opened the envelope carefully, as if the contents might dissolve if handled roughly. The scientific language was dense and technical, but the conclusion was clear. Based on DNA analysis of provided samples, the probability of paternity between Samuel Whitfield, deceased, and Grace Thompson is 99.97%. 99.97%, Maggie read aloud. Grace set down her coffee mug and closed her eyes, 50 years of questions finally answered with scientific certainty. He was my father. He was your father. They sat in the quiet kitchen, both understanding that this moment marked a before and after. Before, Grace had been a woman searching for her identity. After, she was Samuel Whitfield's daughter, with all the complications and responsibilities that came with claiming that heritage in a town like Millbrook. "What happens now?" Grace asked. "Now we call Anton's lawyer and tell him the DNA results confirm what we already knew. Then we wait to see what they do next. And if they still contest the will, then we fight them, with lawyers, with evidence, with whatever it takes." Maggie folded the lab report carefully and placed it in the folder with all the other documentation. "Of Samuel's secret life. Grace, are you sure you want to go through with this? It's only going to get uglier from here." "Maggie, for 49 years I've wondered who my father was, why my mother left the man she loved, whether I was wanted or just an accident that ruined people's lives." Grace's voice was steady but emotional. "Now I know that my father loved my mother enough to support us for 40 years, even though he couldn't be with us. I know that I was created by love, not accident. I'm not walking away from that truth because it makes some people uncomfortable." The phone rang before Maggie could respond. The caller ID showed Anton's number, and Maggie wasn't surprised to hear the cold anger in her brother's voice. "I assume you've gotten the test results by now. We have 99.97% probability of paternity. That doesn't change anything legally. Samuel's will stands as written, and any challenge would have to come from Grace herself, which she's not going to do. We'll see about that. Maggie, you need to understand something. This situation affects more than just our family's finances. There are people in this community who have strong feelings about the past being dredged up unnecessarily. What's that supposed to mean? It means Grace Thompson would be wise to conclude her visit and return to Atlanta before people start asking uncomfortable questions about old relationships and their consequences. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Maggie felt her anger rising, the protective fury that came from seeing someone threaten her family. "Anton, if you or anyone else tries to intimidate Grace, you'll answer to me." "Nobody's intimidating anyone. I'm simply pointing out that small towns have long memories, and some secrets are better left buried." Samuel's love for Rose wasn't a secret to be ashamed of. It was the most honest thing he ever did. Honest or not, it's over. Rose is dead, Samuel is dead, and Grace has no legal claim to anything in this town. The smart thing would be for her to accept that and move on. After Anton hung up, Maggie sat staring at the phone, understanding that her brother's call had been more than just a legal maneuver. It had been a warning. Grace returned from her morning walk around the neighborhood, looking troubled. "There's a car parked across the street," she said. "Black sedan with 2 men inside. They've been there for an hour just watching the house." Maggie looked out the front window and saw the car Grace described. As she watched, one of the men raised what appeared to be a camera with a long lens. "They're photographing the house." Or, "Photographing me. I've seen this before in Atlanta when civil rights cases got messy. Private investigators documenting who goes where, building files on people who ask uncomfortable questions." Anton's lawyer. Maybe. Or maybe people who have their own reasons for wanting the past to stay buried. Maggie thought about James Washington's warnings, about the newspaper clippings Grace had found, about 50 years of secrets that some people had invested significant effort in keeping hidden. "Grace, maybe Anton's right. Maybe it would be safer for you to go back to Atlanta. Is that what you want?" "I want you safe. But I also want—" Maggie stopped, trying to put into words the feeling that had been growing stronger every day since Grace's arrival. "I want Samuel's story to have the ending it deserves. I want him to finally get credit for loving courageously, even if it was love he couldn't claim publicly. And I want to know what it feels like to have roots somewhere, to be connected to a place and a history that goes deeper than my own lifetime." Grace watched the men in the car through the front window. "But I won't put you and Tucker in danger for that. What if we don't have to choose?" What if there's a way to tell Samuel's story publicly, to claim our family connection openly, without backing down to people who want to keep the past buried? How? Maggie thought about Tucker's upcoming school project, about the community relationships she'd been building through her job at the courthouse, about James Washington's quiet support and Mrs. Henderson's protective concern. By making sure the whole community knows the truth, before our opponents can spin it into something ugly, by telling Samuel and Rose's story as a love story, not a scandal, that's risky. Everything worth doing is risky. And besides, Maggie smiled, feeling a surge of the determination that had carried her through single motherhood and multiple moves and every challenge that had brought her to this moment. Samuel spent 40 years being afraid to fight for what he loved. I'm not making the same mistake. The Millbrook Community Center hadn't seen a crowd like this since the integration debates of the 1970s. Word had spread through town with the speed that only small communities could achieve when something truly significant was happening. Maggie had called the meeting for Saturday afternoon, inviting anyone interested in learning about local history and the families who'd shaped their community. What she hadn't expected was for nearly half the town to show up. Grace sat in the front, row beside Tucker, wearing a simple blue dress that Rose would have approved of, dignified, professional, and confident without being confrontational. In her lap, she held the wooden cross Samuel had carved for her, along with the photo albums and documentation that told the story of a love that had survived 50 years of separation. James Washington sat directly behind them with his wife and grandson Marcus, providing the kind of moral support that mattered more than legal representation. Mrs. Henderson had claimed a seat on the aisle, her sharp eyes cataloguing who attended and who stayed away. And in the back of the room, looking distinctly uncomfortable, sat Anton and Bree with their respective spouses and the lawyers who'd been threatening legal action for weeks. "Thank you all for coming," Maggie said, standing at the small podium someone had borrowed from the Methodist Church. 6 months ago, my son Tucker and I inherited my grandfather Samuel Whitfield's house on Maple Street. We thought we were inheriting a building that needed repairs and some old furniture. What we actually inherited was a love story that spans 50 years and connects our family to this community in ways we never imagined. She gestured to Grace. "I'd like you to meet Grace Thompson, a retired high school principal from Atlanta. Grace is also Samuel Whitfield's daughter." The murmur that ran through the crowd was immediate and varied. Surprise from some, recognition from others, and from a few faces in the back, something that looked like anger or fear. "Some of you knew my grandfather well," Grace said, rising to stand beside Maggie. "Others may have known my mother Rose Thompson, who taught at Lincoln Elementary and later at the Consolidated School from 1961 to 1973. What you may not have known is that Samuel and Rose fell in love during those years, and that their relationship resulted in my birth in 1974. An elderly man in the third row raised his hand. "What proof do you have of this relationship?" Grace had anticipated this question. "I have love letters spanning 11 years, photographs of my parents together, property records showing Samuel helped support my mother financially, and DNA evidence confirming that Samuel Whitfield was my biological father." "DNA don't lie," called out a voice from the middle of the room. Maggie recognized the speaker as one of the clerks from the courthouse, a woman who'd been nothing but kind during Maggie's first weeks of work. "Why are you telling us this now?" asked another voice. "Why not while Samuel was alive?" This question came from Mrs. Patterson, Tucker's teacher, and Grace answered it with the patient tone of someone who'd spent decades explaining complex issues to young people. "Because I tried to contact Samuel for 3 years before his death. I sent 23 letters to his home address, all of which were returned unopened. I believe Samuel was afraid of judgment from his community, afraid of damaging his family's reputation, afraid of disrupting the life my mother and I had built in Atlanta. But he knew about you?" This from James Washington, though Maggie suspected he already knew the answer. He knew, and for 40 years he quietly sent money to help support my mother and me. He made sure we had what we needed, even though he couldn't be part of our lives openly. The room was quiet now, people processing the implications of a story that challenged assumptions they'd held for decades about one of their community's most respected residents. Tucker stood up, small but determined. My great-grandfather loved Grace's mother so much that he took care of them for 40 years, even though he couldn't marry her or claim Grace as his daughter. That's not something to be ashamed of. That's something to be proud of. Out of the mouths of babes, murmured Mrs. Henderson, loud enough for half the room to hear. But not everyone was moved by Tucker's innocence. A man Maggie didn't recognize stood up in the back, his face hard with old anger. This is all very touching, he said, but some of us remember what really happened in the 70s. Samuel Whitfield wasn't some romantic hero. He was a white man who couldn't keep his hands off a black woman. And when the consequences caught up with him, he sent her away to avoid the scandal. That's not true, Grace said firmly. My mother left to protect herself and her unborn child from people who threatened violence if she stayed. Violence? The man's laugh was ugly. Who threatened violence? You got any proof of that? Grace looked at Maggie, who nodded encouragement. I have copies of anonymous letters sent to my mother's apartment in 1973, threatening her with physical harm if she didn't leave town. I have hospital records showing she was treated for injuries after someone threw a brick through her window. And I have newspaper clippings documenting what happened to other black families who challenged the social order during those years. The man's face went pale, and Maggie saw him exchange glances with Anton. Understanding dawned with sickening clarity. This wasn't just about family secrets or inheritance disputes. This was about covering up a pattern of intimidation and violence that some people had hoped was buried forever. Samuel Whitfield was a coward, the man said, his voice rising. He should have married her if he loved her so much, instead of sneaking around like what? James Washington stood up, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd earned respect through decades of honest work and community service. Like a man trying to protect the woman he loved from people who would have hurt her for the crime of loving him back. This is ancient history, Anton called out from the back. It doesn't matter now. It matters, Tucker said, his young voice cutting through the adult tension with startling clarity. Because family matters. Because love matters. Because telling the truth matters. Grace reached into her purse and withdrew the wooden cross Samuel had carved for her. My father made this for me 6 months before he died. He never had the courage to give it to me himself, but he made sure I would receive it someday. On the tie back he carved these words, faith, hope and love. The greatest of these is love. She held the cross high enough for the entire room to see. That's Samuel Whitfield's real legacy. Not fear, not secrecy, not shame about loving someone the community disapproved of. Love. Love that lasted 50 years. Love that provided for a child he couldn't acknowledge publicly. Love that was stronger than the hatred and fear some people tried to use against it. The room erupted in applause, not unanimous, but strong enough to show that Grace's words had reached the hearts that were open to hearing them. And in that moment, Maggie understood that they'd won something more important than legal battles or inheritance disputes. They'd won the right to love openly, to claim family without shame, to tell Samuel's story as it deserved to be told. The old man who'd challenged Grace gathered his coat and headed for the door, along with several others, who clearly preferred the comfort of buried secrets to the complexity of acknowledged truth. But most of the crowd remained, and many approached Grace afterward to share their own memories of Rose Thompson or to express support for the family that was finally being made whole. Thank you, Grace said to Maggie as they watched Tucker and Marcus help James Washington fold up the borrowed chairs. For fighting for this, for fighting for us. Thank you for being brave enough to come here, to face down people who wanted you to disappear again. We're family, Grace said simply. Family fights for each other. And as they walked out of the community center together, 3 generations of Samuel Whitfield's legacy, finally united and unashamed, Maggie felt the weight of old secrets lifting from her shoulders like birds taking flight. 6 months later, the house on Maple Street bore little resemblance to the crumbling Victorian that had greeted Maggie and Tucker on their first day in Millbrook. Fresh paint covered the exterior in soft yellow with white trim. The wraparound porch had been restored to its former glory, and the garden bloomed with vegetables and flowers that Samuel would have recognized and approved. But the most significant change wasn't visible from the street. It was the sound of laughter echoing from the kitchen windows, the sight of bicycles in the driveway, and the knowledge that this house was finally, fully, a home for the family it had always been meant to shelter. Grace had taken early retirement from her position in Atlanta and moved to Millbrook permanently, purchasing the small house 2 streets over that had once belonged to Mrs. Henderson's late sister. She'd thrown herself into community life with the energy of someone making up for lost time, volunteering at the library, organizing a summer reading program for children, and serving on the church committee that managed community outreach programs. It's funny, she told Maggie one evening as they worked together in Samuel's garden. I spent 49 years feeling like I didn't quite belong anywhere. Now I can't imagine living anywhere else. The legal challenges from Anton and Bree had collapsed. Once the DNA results became public knowledge and community support rallied around Grace's story. Their lawyers had quietly advised them that contesting a will based on moral objections to interracial relationships would not play well in any courtroom in 2025, and that continuing to fight would only generate more negative publicity for their family name. Anton had eventually approached Maggie with something resembling an apology, though it was buried under layers of justification about protecting family reputation and concern about legal complications. Bree remained distant, but no longer actively hostile, having apparently decided that ignoring the situation was preferable to acknowledging she'd been wrong. Jed, surprisingly, had been the first to reach out to Grace directly, bringing his youngest daughter to meet her new great-aunt and asking thoughtful questions about Rose's teaching career. I remember her, he'd admitted. She came to our house once when I was about 12 to talk to Mama about some school thing. She was beautiful and smart, and I could see why I can see why he loved her. Tucker had thrived in ways that amazed Maggie. The shy, cautious boy who'd arrived in Millbrook had blossomed into a confident young man who served as an unofficial tour guide for the many visitors who came to hear Grace tell Samuel and Rose's story. His friendship with Marcus Washington had deepened into the kind of brotherhood that crossed all social boundaries, and his academic performance had earned him recognition as one of the brightest students in his grade. "Mom," he said one Saturday morning as they prepared for yet another visit from family history researchers, "do you think Samuel can see us now? Do you think he knows we found Grace and brought her home?" "I think," Maggie said, looking around, the kitchen that had become the heart of their restored family, "that Samuel is finally at peace. He spent 40 years carrying the weight of love he couldn't express. Now his love has a happy ending." The visitors that day were a documentary crew from Atlanta working on a film about unsung love stories of the civil rights era. They'd heard about Samuel and Rose through Grace's advocacy work with organizations that preserved African American history, and they wanted to include their story as an example of love that transcended social boundaries. "What do you think is the most important lesson people can learn from your grandfather's story?" the interviewer asked Tucker. Tucker considered the question with the seriousness he brought to all important matters. "I think it's that love is always brave, even when the people feeling it aren't ready to be brave yet. And that it's never too late to do the right thing, even if you have to do it through other people." Grace added her own perspective. "Samuel and my mother faced impossible choices in their time. They couldn't have the love story they wanted, but they could still love each other in whatever ways were possible. And that love created me and eventually brought all of us together. So maybe the lesson is that love finds a way, even across decades, and despite obstacles that seem insurmountable. The interviewer turned to Maggie. As the person who inherited not just Samuel's house, but also his secrets, what would you want people to understand about family and belonging? I'd want them to understand that family isn't just about blood relationships or legal documents. It's about choosing to love people and stand by them, especially when that choice requires courage. Maggie looked at Grace and Tucker, her heart full with the rightness of this life they'd built together. When I inherited this house, I thought I was getting property. What I actually inherited was the chance to complete a love story that had been interrupted by fear and circumstances. And I learned that some blessings come disguised as burdens, that some of the most valuable things are the ones other people don't want. After the documentary crew left, the three of them sat on the front porch as evening approached, watching neighbors walk their dogs and children ride bicycles in the street. Mrs. Henderson waved from her garden, where she was harvesting late tomatoes. James Washington called out a greeting from his driveway as he washed his truck. "It's a good life," Grace said simply. "It's the life Samuel wanted for you," Maggie replied. "A life where you belong somewhere, where you're known and valued, where you don't have to hide who you are or where you come from." Tucker was working on a wooden birdhouse in the style Samuel had favored, using tools from the basement workshop and techniques James Washington had been teaching him. His young hands moved confidently over the smooth wood, creating something beautiful and functional that would outlast the seasons. "I finished the family tree project for school," he announced. "Mrs. Patterson says it's the most complete family history she's ever seen from a student." "That's because we finally know the whole story," Grace said. "Not the whole story," Tucker corrected with a grin. "We're still writing it." As the sun set behind the oak trees that had witnessed 4 generations of Whitfield family history, Maggie felt the deep satisfaction that came from work well done, love well expressed, and courage well applied. Samuel's house had been transformed from a repository of secrets into a celebration of truth. Rose's love had been vindicated and honored. Grace had found the family connection she'd spent a lifetime seeking, and sometimes, in the evening light, filtering through the restored windows, Maggie could almost feel Samuel's presence in the house. Not the lonely, regretful man who'd died there, but the young man who'd fallen in love with a teacher named Rose and spent 40 years finding ways to care for the family he'd created with her. The mockingbird in the oak tree began his evening song, weaving together melodies learned from other birds, other places, other times. Like the family gathered on the porch below, he was creating something new from pieces of the past, something that honored what came before while building toward what was yet to come. Sometimes the things people throw away are exactly what you need most. Sometimes what looks like a burden becomes your greatest blessing. And sometimes, if you're very lucky and very brave, love gets a second chance to write its own ending.